The cemetery was silent, except for the soft rustle of autumn leaves. A grieving father, Richard Hale, wealthy, powerful, but shattered, walked toward his son's grave, carrying fresh flowers. As he approached, he froze. Two young black boys, about 11 and 13, knelt beside the tombstone, crying openly. One whispered, "I miss him. He was the only one who believed in us." The other placed a small toy car beside the stone. Richard tightened his grip, heart pounding. He didn't recognize them. He had no idea why they were mourning Daniel Hale, his only child. But when they turned around, their story hit him harder than grief ever had. Before we begin, subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from, so we can bring more stories like these. The house was too big for silence. It echoed in places silence shouldn't echo. In the doorway, where a pair of sneakers once sat. In the living room, where a teenage laugh used to live. In the hallway, where the memories hid like ghosts that refused to leave. Richard moved through it the same way he had for months. Slowly, mechanically, like a man learning how to walk again after losing a limb. He was 52, polished and put together in the way only self-made men understood. Crisp dress shirt, pressed slacks, watch that cost more than a used car. But beneath all that careful composure, his eyes held the kind of sorrow you could drown in. Every morning, he followed the same routine. He stepped into the kitchen. The coffee machine had already brewed a fresh pot. He'd set the timer the night before. It had been brewing automatically for months now, long after he stopped craving the taste. The mug he poured was always the same dark blue one, Daniel's favorite color. He held it with both hands out of habit, not desire. He sat at the table, overlooking the backyard, where Daniel used to kick a soccer ball against the fence until Richard begged him to stop before it broke. He remembered the laughter that followed. Now, he only heard memory. The coffee sat steaming for a while, then cooling, then turning lukewarm. Richard rarely took more than a sip. Most mornings, he forgot it was even there. His wife, Elena, peeked into the kitchen doorway like she didn't want to startle him. She always checked on him this way, cautious, caring, but letting him keep his space. "You slept at all?" she asked gently. "Enough," he lied, the way he lied every morning. She nodded. She knew the truth. But she also knew pushing too hard would only make him retreat deeper into the quiet he'd built around himself. "I'm heading out," Richard said, standing up and adjusting the sleeve of his shirt. "Sunday," she reminded softly, though she didn't need to. He never forgot Sundays. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, and she rested a hand briefly on his chest. "Drive safe," she whispered. He always did. He drove like a man who knew how fragile life was now. Minutes later, he was in his car, hands gripping the leather steering wheel. The engine hummed softly, but the weight in his chest remained unmoving. The world outside was alive. Joggers passing, dogs barking, neighbors clipping hedges. Life didn't pause for grief. It just grew around it. He pulled out of the driveway and began the familiar route toward the cemetery. 37 minutes if traffic was light. 45 if the city felt cruel. The radio stayed off. Music used to be Daniel's thing. Loud, energetic, thumping through the house. Now, every song felt like a bruise. Richard drove through the nicer streets first. Clean sidewalks, bikes on lawns, bright houses with children laughing on porches. Then the scenery changed. The pavement cracked. The buildings grew older, paint peeling off brick, windows boarded, trash bins overflowing. A neighborhood his company once promised to revitalize, a promise that died somewhere between contracts and investors. Richard swallowed the guilt. Not fresh guilt, but that old nagging shame he'd learned to tuck into the back pocket of his conscience. Then he saw them, two boys, walking close together, like brothers, one a few years older than the other, both carrying something wrapped in a cloth, something the smaller boy held like it mattered more than air. Richard slowed down slightly, blinking at them. Something tugged at him, not recognition, more like instinct, like the universe whispering, "Pay attention." But grief fogged that whisper. He was too tired to listen. He kept driving. By the time he reached the cemetery gates, the morning sun had fully risen. The air smelled of cut grass and damp stone. The place was beautiful, in an aching kind of way, a sanctuary carved out of sorrow. Richard stepped out of the car, straightened his jacket, and walked the gravel path. He noticed it almost immediately. One of the groundskeepers was pacing near the old oak tree, glancing around nervously. Another whispered something to the security guard, who shook his head. When Richard approached, the guard stalled him gently. "Morning, sir. Just so you know, we had kids here earlier. Looked like they were wandering around." "Kids?" Richard frowned. "Two boys." The guard pointed vaguely toward the deeper rows of stones. "Didn't cause trouble, just odd to see them here this early." Richard nodded slowly. "Did they take anything?" he asked. The guard hesitated. Not sure. Richard walked faster, his pulse tapping against his neck. When he reached his son's gravestone, his foot caught on something. A fallen stem. He looked down. The bouquet he'd left yesterday, gone. Not blown away. Gone. Taken. His jaw clenched. But not from anger. From confusion. From that same whisper in his mind telling him something was happening. Something he wasn't seeing yet. He crouched, running a hand over the cold stone. "Morning, Danny," he murmured. His voice cracked. It always cracked here. He let out a long breath, the kind that tried to steady a shaking heart. Today was supposed to be just another Sunday. Heavy, quiet, predictable. A man talking to a grave. A father learning to breathe again. A ritual that held his broken world in place. But this morning had threads in it. Strange, fragile threads pulling towards something he didn't yet understand. Something waiting just out of sight. He didn't know yet. Those two boys would break open a truth he didn't know he needed. He didn't know. Today would shift the entire weight of his grief. He didn't know. This ordinary morning was the last ordinary moment of his life. Everything was about to change. Richard stayed crouched there for a while, fingers brushing the edge of the stone, like he could somehow feel his son through it. "Someone took the flowers," he whispered, trying to keep his voice level. The wind moved softly through the trees, leaves rustling like distant applause. No answer, just quiet. He straightened slowly, knees protesting. 52 felt older in graveyards. He turned his head and scanned the surrounding plots. A few had wilted arrangements. Others had fake flowers bleached by the sun. His bouquet had been fresh, vibrant yellows and deep blues. Daniel had liked blue. Now the space where he'd placed them yesterday was bare. He looked back toward the path. The groundskeeper he'd seen earlier, gray beard, cap pulled low, was pretending to adjust a sprinkler head that didn't appear to be broken. Every few seconds, the man flicked his eyes toward Richard and then away, like he was waiting to see if something would explode. Richard walked toward him. "Excuse me," he said. The groundskeeper straightened, wiping imaginary dirt off his hands onto his pants. "Yes, sir. Did you see anyone take the flowers from my son's grave?" The man hesitated just a fraction of a second. Richard caught it. "Well," the groundskeeper said, scratching his cheek, "we had some kids through here earlier. 2 boys. Young. They were respectful enough. Just didn't seem like they had any business here." "What were they doing?" Richard asked. "Walking. Looking around. They weren't tearing anything up. Just out of place." He paused. "One of them was carrying something. Wrapped in cloth, I think." Richard's mind flashed back to the street. 2 boys. Same description. Same cloth. He felt a strange tug in his chest. "Did they go near this section?" he asked. The groundskeeper nodded. "Yeah, I saw him head down this row. Thought about saying something, but they weren't really doing harm. And kids grieve too, you know?" Richard swallowed. Kids. Grieving. Here. He thanked the man and walked back toward Daniel's grave, trying to connect the dots through a fog that didn't want to let him think too deeply. Kids at the cemetery. Flowers. Gone. The security guard saying they'd been wandering. The wrapped object in the street. His brain nudged him toward curiosity. His heart dragged him back toward habit. He stood before his son's stone again, breathing in the damp smell of grass and marble. "Probably nothing," he said under his breath. "People take flowers. It happens." He tried to believe it, to file it away as random, as unimportant. But little signs clung to him as he walked slowly along the row. A scuff mark in the dirt where someone small had knelt. A faint smudge on the base of Daniel's stone, like fingers had rested there. The slightest outline of footprints where the grass was worn. He followed them with his eyes. 2 sets, one a bit larger, one smaller. They led from the path to Daniel's grave, then away again, toward the back of the cemetery. He could have followed, could have tracked them like a trail, could have let curiosity take the wheel. Instead, he closed his eyes. Grief pressed in like a heavy hand on his chest. He'd come here to do what he always did. Stand, talk, hurt, leave. Complicating it, chasing mysteries, asking questions, felt like more energy than he had. He kneaded the bridge of his nose with his thumb and forefinger, exhaling shakily. "Not today," he muttered to himself. "Not today, when getting out of bed already felt like a war. Not today, when just saying his son's name out loud made his throat tighten. Not today, when routine was the only thing keeping him from falling apart completely." He walked back to the car, each step heavy, slow. Near the gate, the security guard gave him a sympathetic nod. "Everything all right, Mr. Clark?" he asked. Richard nodded, though nothing inside him agreed. "Just kids?" he asked. "Looked that way," the guard said. "They were here early, before 6. I asked them what they were doing, and they said they were visiting somebody." He shrugged. Didn't look like they were lying, just looked sad. Sad. That hung in the air between them. Richard forced a small, brittle smile. "Kids shouldn't know sadness at cemeteries," he said quietly. The guard sighed. "World doesn't really ask what they should know." Richard moved on, hand brushing absent-mindedly against the top of a stone as he passed. He reached his car and opened the door, pausing with one hand on the roof as he looked back over the rows of markers. There was a strange, lingering feeling he couldn't name, like the cemetery had shifted while he wasn't looking, like something had moved in the atmosphere. The missing flowers, the boys, the nervous glances, a pattern he wasn't ready to see yet. He slipped into the driver's seat and closed the door. The sound was soft but definitive, a gentle barrier between him and the weight of all those names behind him. He sat without starting the engine, staring straight ahead. His reflection ghosted faintly in the windshield. Sharp suit. Tired eyes. Man with more money than he could spend and less peace than he'd ever known. He rubbed a hand over his face. "Daniel," he whispered, staring at nothing. "I don't know how to do this without you, kid." The silence answered with the same indifferent quiet it always did. He finally turned the key, the engine humming to life. As he pulled away, his tires crunched over the gravel. In his rearview mirror, he saw a small figure near the far corner of the cemetery. Too far to make out clearly. A kid, maybe, or just his imagination. He didn't slow down to check. He drove back through the neighborhoods, the route he'd taken so many times, it felt like the road itself remembered his thoughts. Back through the cracked sidewalks, past shuttered storefronts, past the graffiti-covered wall his company's logo had once been painted on. He passed the corner where he'd seen the two boys earlier. They weren't there now. The street was almost empty. Just a woman dragging a trash bin, and a man sitting on a stoop with a cigarette. Richard's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he drove through the intersection. He wondered, briefly, what his son would have thought of this neighborhood. If he'd ever noticed it. If he'd ever cared about the gap between the world inside their gated community and the world beyond it. Of course he would have cared, he thought suddenly. Daniel had been soft-hearted, gentle, quiet, but tuned in. He'd always noticed the kid in class who didn't talk, the stray dog, the elderly neighbor with too many grocery bags. "Dad, can I help him?" was a phrase that used to annoy Richard when he was busy. But now, he missed it so much it hurt. He shook his head. He didn't let his mind stay there long. Grief had a way of punishing you for thinking too hard. By the time he pulled back into his driveway, the strange strands of that morning had already started to drift into the background of his thoughts. Kids at the cemetery, missing bouquet, nervous groundskeepers. He told himself it was nothing. Coincidence, randomness, one-off weirdness in a world that had plenty already. He walked into the house, set his keys down in the same place he always did, and heard Elena's voice float from the living room. "You okay?" she called gently. "Yeah," he lied again, because it was easier than unpacking everything. "Did you see anyone?" she asked, meaning other grieving families, the usual older couples, the rare child visiting a grandparent's grave. "Just the usual," he said, shrugging off his jacket. He didn't mention the boys. Maybe he didn't think it mattered. Maybe a part of him was afraid of what it meant. Maybe he was too drained to chase shadows. He poured himself another cup of coffee he wouldn't drink and stared out the kitchen window at the trimmed hedges, the polished patio, the perfectly kept lawn. Safe, clean, controlled. Nothing like the streets he'd driven through on the way there. Nothing like the places his company once stamped promises on and then quietly abandoned. He let the steam from the mug wrap around his face, eyes distant. This was his world. The graveyard, the big empty house, the weight in his chest. And somewhere out there, two boys carried something wrapped in cloth and cried at a headstone with his son's name on it. But for now, that connection remained out of reach, a thread hanging just out of his grieving hand. For now he let it go. He'd follow it soon enough. He just didn't know that yet. It was nearly noon when Richard returned to the cemetery. He told himself he was going back because he'd forgotten to place a fresh bouquet. Told himself it was routine. Told himself he wasn't thinking about the missing flowers, or the boys, or the strange tension in the air that morning. But deep down, beneath the grief and habit, something tugged at him. A whisper of instinct he could no longer ignore. He parked near the older section of the grounds, where crooked stones leaned like tired elders, listening to secrets. The sky was muted, gray clouds spreading quietly, softening the daylight. He carried the new bouquet in one hand, but when he reached the familiar row, he froze. Two shapes knelt beside Daniel's grave. Small shapes, fragile shapes, the boys. The older one, maybe 14, maybe 15, shoulders curved inward, like he was trying to make himself smaller. His head bent, as if he was apologizing to the earth. The younger boy, barely 8 or 9, clutched something to his chest. Wrapped in the same cloth, he stepped forward slowly, making sure his footsteps were loud enough to announce him. He didn't want to startle them. The older boy heard him first. He jerked upright, eyes wide, wiping his face with the back of his hand. He stood quickly, pushing the younger boy gently behind him in a protective motion. That small gesture, guarding his brother, hit Richard like a punch. "I'm sorry," the older boy blurted, voice shaking, rough around the edges. We're not messing anything up." The younger boy sniffed, clutching the bundle tighter. Richard swallowed, lifting his hands a little in a calming gesture. "It's all right," he said softly. "I'm not upset." The older boy didn't relax. He looked ready to run. Richard's gaze drifted to the grave, then back to them. "I'm Daniel's father." The boys went still. The younger boy's fingers tightened around the cloth-wrapped object, knuckles going pale. The older boy dropped his eyes, ashamed. "We're sorry. We didn't mean to bother anything. We were just—" His voice cracked. Richard took a small, cautious step closer. "It's okay. You weren't bothering anything." The older boy swallowed hard. "We didn't take nothing. We brought something." Richard blinked. He followed the boy's gaze, the younger child now gently unfolding the cloth. Inside was a small blue toy car, scratched, well-loved, the kind a child carries everywhere. It was placed carefully at the base of Daniel's gravestone, near the carved date. The little boy sniffed again, whispering something Richard couldn't hear. The older boy cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. "Caleb, say it louder." Caleb looked up at Richard, big, watery eyes that held too much sadness for a child his age. He whispered again, this time louder. It was Danny's favorite color, blue, like this. Richard felt his breath leave his chest entirely. Danny, no one called him that except close friends and family. He knelt slowly beside them, every movement gentle, like the air had turned fragile. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. The older boy hesitated, looked like he wanted to lie, then finally said, Ethan Brooks. "And this is my little brother, Caleb." Richard nodded, grounding himself with a slow breath. Ethan, Caleb. He repeated their names softly, anchoring them in his mind. How did you know my son?" Ethan's throat bobbed. He wiped at his cheeks again, embarrassed to be crying in front of a stranger. He looked at Caleb, then at the toy car, then finally met Richard's eyes. "Ethan saved us," Ethan whispered. Richard felt the cemetery tilt beneath him. Ethan continued, voice trembling, more than once. Richard blinked, stunned. "Daniel never told me. He never said." Ethan cut him off with a tiny shake of his head. He didn't want to get in trouble. He didn't want nobody thinking he was hanging around kids like us. Caleb sniffed again, hugging his own arms. He said he didn't want to make it weird. Richard's chest tightened painfully. Ethan took a shaky breath. "We should go. We shouldn't be here. We didn't mean to upset you." He grabbed Caleb's hand, pulling him gently. They turned to leave. Richard didn't stop them. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. The words he saved us repeated in his mind like a heartbeat. His son? His quiet, introverted, guarded son? Saving kids? Helping them? Being a part of their lives? Why didn't Daniel tell him? Why didn't Richard see it? Why had his son carried this part of himself alone? The boys were 10 steps away when Richard finally found his voice. "Wait." It came out broken. The boys paused, turning slowly. Richard took 2 steps toward them, eyes burning not with anger, but with something deeper, something raw and aching. "Please, tell me how you knew him." He didn't shout. He didn't demand. He just asked like a man asking for air. Ethan hesitated. Fear flickered in his expression. Fear of adults, fear of consequences, fear of being seen. Caleb squeezed his hand. Finally, Ethan whispered, "He used to come find us, on the benches over there, near the old fountain." "Why?" Richard asked, voice barely more than a breath. Ethan answered with a simplicity that shattered him. "Because we needed somebody, and he knew." Richard felt his knees weaken, felt the world shift under the weight of truth. Daniel had lived a life he'd never told his father about, a life filled with small acts of kindness that Richard had been too busy, too blind, or too far away to notice. Ethan took a cautious step backward. "We're sorry, sir," he repeated. "We'll leave." Richard couldn't speak. He just watched as the 2 boys, the only living pieces of his son's hidden heart, slowly turned and walked down the gravel path. Sunlight hit the toy car at Daniel's grave, making the scratched blue paint gleam. Richard's whole body shook. He thought he came to mourn. He didn't know he'd come to discover. Richard stayed frozen in place long after Ethan and Caleb turned the corner and disappeared behind the row of angel statues. His hands hung useless at his sides. His throat felt tight. His chest felt crushed beneath a weight he'd never carried before, a weight he didn't even have a name for yet. He stared at Daniel's grave, at the fresh scratch of blue paint on the toy car, at the faint smudges where the boy's small hands had rested, at the empty space that wasn't so empty anymore. His son had lived a life he never knew. He sank to one knee again, fingertips brushing the carved letters of Daniel's name. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered. The air didn't answer. A voice behind him did. "Because he didn't do it to be praised." Richard turned quickly. The older groundskeeper, the same man from earlier, gray beard, tired eyes, stood a few feet away, holding a rake he clearly wasn't using. He looked at Richard with a gentleness that didn't feel intrusive, a softness that felt almost knowing. Richard stood slowly. You knew my son?" The man nodded. "Name's Mr. Reynolds." He stepped closer, leaning on the rake like it was more for balance than for work. "I wasn't gonna say nothing earlier," Reynolds said, voice low. "But now that you've seen those boys, I reckon you deserve to know." Richard's brows pulled together. "Know what?" Reynolds looked at the grave, then at Richard, then back at the grave again, like gathering the right words. "Your son," he said finally, "was here more often than you think." Richard's breath caught. "Daniel, here? What do you mean?" Reynolds sighed through his nose. "Most teenagers hate cemeteries, avoid them like the plague, but not your boy." He pointed toward a worn stone bench near the old fountain, the one that always squeaked when someone sat on it. He used to sit there, every week, sometimes twice a week, sometimes more. Richard stared, speechless. Reynolds kept talking, voice steady but full of something heavy. Admiration, respect, maybe a little grief of his own. Always had that backpack with him, always brought snacks, sandwiches sometimes, little juice boxes. Thought he was just eating lunch in the quiet, you know? Kids find weird places to think. He shook his head gently, but then I started noticing he wasn't alone. Richard swallowed hard. Ethan and Caleb. Yep, Reynolds said softly. Them. And sometimes another kid from their street, but mostly those two. Richard lowered himself onto the stone edge of the nearest plot, needing to sit. Reynolds stepped a little closer, speaking like he was recounting something sacred. He'd tutor 'em, he said. Math, reading, whatever they had trouble with. I'd hear him sometimes. Patient kid, gentle voice, never talked down to him. Richard squeezed his hands together. He never mentioned them to us. He didn't want to worry you, Reynolds replied, and he wasn't doing it for attention, just doing it because it was the right thing. He'd give him his allowance sometimes, leftovers from lunch, even brought him clothes once. He chuckled softly, though there wasn't much humor in it. I caught him once trying to sneak a winter coat to Caleb, tried to make it look like he found it, like he was some coat fairy. Richard let out a shaky exhale, blinking back the flood building behind his eyes. Reynolds' expression softened even more. Your son had a big heart, he said simply, bigger than most grown men around here. He protected those boys too, stood up for them when some older kids picked on him. That made Richard's eyes widen. He got into a fight? No, sir. He didn't throw a punch, just stood his ground, talked calm, like he wasn't scared. Reynolds smiled faintly, the kind of courage you don't see often. Richard stared at the grass beneath his shoes, fighting the tremor in his breathing. Reynolds continued, voice lowering. Few weeks before, he hesitated respectfully. Before the accident, Daniel told me those boys were something special. Said they reminded him of himself when he was younger. Richard's head snapped up. Of himself? Daniel wasn't struggling. But he cut himself off, because deep down, in a place he never examined, he knew Daniel had struggled, quietly, alone, without asking for help. Reynolds nodded gently, like he heard the thought, even without the words. He wasn't the kind of kid to dump problems on his parents, Reynolds said. Didn't want y'all worrying, but he saw those boys and he saw vulnerability, the kind he understood. Richard put a hand to his forehead, overwhelmed. Reynolds drew a long, slow breath. I didn't know how to tell you this, he admitted, but the boys, they came here the day he died. They waited for him. Richard's heart stopped. What? Reynolds' voice cracked, just slightly. He was supposed to tutor him that afternoon. Richard stood abruptly, breath punching out of him. No, he said, shaking his head, voice cracking. He wasn't going to see them. Reynolds met his eyes, gentle but firm. He was. Richard felt every bone inside him go cold, every piece of grief sharpened, every unanswered question rearranged itself. Reynolds stepped closer and placed a weathered hand on Richard's shoulder. Your boy wasn't just a good kid, he said softly. He was a good soul, the kind that hides what he gives, the kind that helps without needing applause. Richard covered his mouth with his hand. His entire body shook, not just from sorrow, from realization. My God, he whispered. I didn't know him at all. Reynolds squeezed his shoulder. You did, he said. Just not all of him. Silence settled between them, heavy, sacred. Then Reynolds stepped back, giving Richard space, his voice gentle. He didn't brag. He didn't brag to me, and he sure didn't brag to you. He just cared. He pointed to the toy car. Those boys loved him, sir. They really did. Richard turned toward the grave again, tears spilling freely now. He knelt beside the toy car, touching it with trembling fingers. Daniel had been a better man than him, kinder, softer, braver, and he'd never said a word. Richard closed his eyes. He wasn't sure how long he stayed there. But he knew this: grief had just changed shape. It wasn't just pain anymore. It was revelation. And it was only the beginning. Richard didn't leave the cemetery right away. He couldn't. His legs felt rooted to the earth, like grief itself had reached up from the ground and wrapped around his ankles. The toy car sat at the foot of the gravestone, a blue whisper of a life he didn't fully understand anymore. Daniel hadn't been who he thought. He hadn't just been a son. He'd been a protector, a mentor, a quiet hero moving through a world Richard had never stepped into. And now, everything inside him was coming undone. He wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his jacket, took a steadying breath, and followed the path the boys had taken earlier. He didn't know why. He didn't think. He just moved. Something inside him, instinct, desperation, something paternal and aching, told him he needed answers, not from groundskeepers, not from guards, not from memories that only half told the truth. He needed them from the boys. He found them a few blocks away. Ethan and Caleb were sitting on the curb near the cemetery's outer wall, their backs against the cracked paint, knees pulled to their chests. Caleb's face was hidden behind his hands. Ethan kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected trouble to find them. Richard slowed his steps before approaching, careful not to look like a threat. As soon as Ethan noticed him, he tensed. Caleb grabbed his brother's shirt. Richard lifted a hand gently. "It's okay," he said. "I'm not angry." Ethan didn't relax. His chin lifted slightly, protective, wary, older than his years. Caleb peeked up, cheeks still wet. "We didn't mean nothing bad, sir." Richard shook his head, kneeling down so he was eye level with them. "I know," he said softly. "You didn't do anything wrong." Ethan swallowed. His voice wavered. "We're sorry we took the flowers." Richard blinked. "You took them?" Ethan nodded, embarrassed. "We wanted to give Daniel something nice. We don't got money for real flowers, so we borrowed yours. Only for today. We were gonna put them back." Caleb sniffed loudly beside him. "We didn't want to steal. We just wanted him to have something pretty." The honesty hit Richard like a blow. He exhaled shakily. "You don't have to apologize for that." Ethan looked down at his shoes. "We didn't think nobody would care." Richard's voice cracked. "I care." Ethan hesitated, then whispered, "We cared too." Richard sat down beside them, right there on the curb. A millionaire in polished shoes, sitting on broken concrete next to two boys from a neighborhood his company had abandoned. He looked at them, really looked at them. Thin clothes, untied sneakers, hair slightly unkempt, eyes older than their faces. This was the world Daniel had walked into willingly. This was the world he'd chosen to give to. Richard swallowed hard. Can you tell me," he asked gently, "how you knew him?" Ethan glanced around, making sure no one was watching, as if the truth itself was dangerous. Then he started. "He used to come to the shelter," Ethan said quietly. "Not inside, just outside. Sat with us on the bench." Caleb nodded vigorously, clinging to his brother's arm. "He brought us food and books," Ethan continued, voice soft but steadying with each sentence. "He helped me with math so I wouldn't fall behind. Helped Caleb with reading. He'd stay till dark sometimes." Richard's heart clenched. Why didn't he tell anyone? Ethan shrugged weakly, said he didn't want people thinking he was showing off or that we were charity. He sniffed, wiping his sleeve across his face. Said we were his friends. The word hit Richard deeper than he expected. Friends. Not a secret project. Not a pity mission. Friends. Caleb whispered, "He called us his little brothers." Richard felt tears spill before he could stop them. He pressed a hand to his mouth. "Daniel," he whispered. "My God." Ethan nodded, eyes filling too. He said he was gonna help us get into a better school. Said he knew someone who could help. Richard's breath hitched. He promised he'd come teach us last month. The day. Ethan's voice broke. He looked away. Caleb's lip trembled. The day Richard reached out instinctively, placing a gentle hand on Caleb's back. "It's okay," he whispered. "You don't have to say it." But Caleb shook his head fiercely and forced the words out. "He died coming to see us." Richard's hand froze. Ethan's face crumpled. "We heard it on the news, and we thought, if he wasn't coming to help us, if he wasn't walking that road, if he wasn't, then maybe." His voice cracked. Caleb's shoulders shook. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut and whispered the words that shattered Richard's heart completely. Maybe he'd still be alive if he wasn't trying to help us. Richard couldn't breathe. He couldn't think, couldn't swallow the lump in his throat. He grabbed Ethan gently but firmly by the shoulders. "Look at me." Ethan looked up through tears. "You listen," Richard said, voice trembling but steady in its conviction. "And you listen carefully. Daniel didn't die because of you. Daniel didn't die because he cared. Daniel didn't die because he helped." He shook his head, tears slipping freely now. "He died because life is cruel and random and unfair, not because of anything you did." Ethan covered his mouth, sobbing silently. Caleb leaned into Richard instinctively, like a child seeking safety. Richard wrapped an arm around both boys, pulling them into him without hesitation. For a long moment, the three of them sat there, a grieving father, two broken-hearted boys, all connected by the same loss. Richard whispered into their hair, his voice cracking open. "If anything, he lived because of you. He lived better because he had you." Caleb sobbed harder. Ethan pressed his forehead against Richard's shoulder. Cars passed. People walked by. The world kept moving. But for the first time in months, Richard felt alive. Not healed, not whole, but awake. Painfully, beautifully awake to the son he never fully knew, and the pieces of Daniel that lived on in these two boys. The boys didn't ask Richard for a ride. They didn't even hint at it. They simply stood up after the tears faded, wiped their faces with the backs of their hands, and started walking in the direction of the cracked sidewalk leading deeper into the neighborhood. Ethan kept his head down. Caleb dragged his feet slightly. The cloth that once wrapped the blue toy car now balled tightly in his fist. Richard rose to his feet and followed, slow at first, unsure if he should. Unsure if he was intruding on something sacred. But every instinct inside him screamed, "Don't let them walk this alone. Don't let your son's world stay a mystery." He caught up beside them, but didn't force conversation. Ethan looked up for a moment, startled, then relaxed just a little. "You don't gotta come with us," he murmured. Richard shook his head gently. "I want to." The boy didn't argue. They walked together through streets Richard had only ever driven past with his windows rolled up. Streets his company once promised to revitalize, but never touched again once the investors lost interest. Now, seeing it on foot, Everything hit differently. The cracked pavement wasn't just city neglect. It was a path Daniel had walked. The graffiti wasn't just vandalism. It was scenery Daniel had seen. The closed shops weren't just business failures. They were obstacles Daniel had stepped around on the way to the boys. Every shadow, every flicker of life in alleyways, every sound, it all suddenly mattered. Because his son had been here, and he hadn't known. Caleb tugged Ethan's sleeve. "Are we going to get in trouble?" he whispered, eyeing Richard. Ethan glanced back nervously. He said, "No, it's okay." Richard swallowed the ache that rose again. "Boys," he said softly, "you're not in trouble. Not with me. Not ever." Caleb's shoulders softened. Just a little. Ethan pointed ahead. "That's the shelter." Richard followed their gaze, and his stomach dropped. The shelter was in worse shape than he imagined. Windows patched with cardboard. Half the roof covered with a mismatched tarp. A sagging fence leaning dangerously to one side. Kids in worn clothes sitting on the steps. Some playing with broken toys, some not playing at all. This wasn't just poverty. This was survival. A building held together by tired hands and good intentions, not by resources. And Daniel had walked into this place willingly. Every week. The thought made Richard grip the strap of his coat until his knuckles whitened. Ethan led them through the gate. It squeaked loudly, metal screeching like it hurt to move. Inside the courtyard, kids stopped what they were doing and stared. Not at Ethan, not at Caleb, at Richard. A man in expensive clothes. A man who didn't belong here. A man who had nothing to do with their world. A little girl tugged on an older boy's sleeve. "Who's he?" "I don't know," the boy muttered. "Looks like someone's dad got lost." Someone's dad. Richard felt the jab, clean and merciless. Ethan led him inside the shelter, the air thick with the scent of too many bodies in too small a space. Old couches sagged in the common room. Posters peeled off the walls. The lights flickered faintly overhead. Caleb slipped his small hand into Ethan's. "I'm hungry," he whispered. Ethan nodded. "We'll eat later." Richard's throat tightened. These boys weren't just poor. They were neglected by the entire system. "Does anyone take care of you here?" he asked gently. Ethan shrugged. "They try, but there's too many of us. Not enough food sometimes. Not enough time." He looked Richard straight in the eye. And in that moment, no child had ever Lou. Daniel helped. It was simple. It was honest. It was devastating. Richard couldn't breathe for a moment. He walked deeper into the shelter, seeing the world his son had cared about. Not as a news headline, not as a charity case, but as people. People Daniel had fed, taught, encouraged, laughed with, protected. He paused at a table with scattered worksheets. Some completed, some scribbled on. A familiar handwriting caught his eye. Daniel's. Little notes written in the margins. "You got this, buddy." "Almost perfect. Try again. Proud of you." Richard touched the corner of the paper, fingertips trembling. His son had sat here, right in this chair, with these kids, teaching them, loving them quietly. And he had never told his father. Why? Why had Daniel kept all of this a secret? Richard felt his knees weaken. He sank into the chair, without meaning to. Ethan approached, worried. "Are you okay, sir?" Richard nodded, though tears threatened again. "I'm just trying to understand." Caleb leaned his tiny head against Richard's arm. Danny was real good. Richard wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I know," he whispered, but he didn't know. Not really, not like this. Every part of his understanding of Daniel was being rewritten right here, in a room with peeling paint and children who depended on a teenager who no one else ever thought to look for. "Ethan," Richard said softly, voice strained. "Why didn't he tell anyone? Why didn't he tell us?" Ethan lowered his eyes. "Because he wanted to fix things on his own," he said. "He didn't want to bother nobody. He said adults always talk but never do nothing. He said he'd do what he could, till he was older and could do more." Richard pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the crack widen. He whispered, barely audible, "Son, what were you trying to show me?" For the first time in months, the grief shifted. Not fading, not healing, but transforming into something sharper, more urgent. Purpose. Richard stood slowly, turning to Ethan and Caleb. "I'm going to help you," he said, voice trembling with both emotion and determination. Ethan blinked. "You don't have to, sir." "I do," Richard said firmly. "Not because I pity you, not because I'm wealthy." He paused. "But because my son loved you." Caleb sniffed, a tear rolling down his cheek. "We loved him too." Richard knelt to their level, placing a hand on each boy's shoulder. "You are not alone," he said. "Not anymore." For the first time since Daniel's death, Richard felt like he was breathing something other than sorrow. He was breathing responsibility, love, truth, redemption. His son wasn't gone. His son's heart was right in front of him, split into two small, fragile boys who desperately needed the kind of help Daniel had been trying to give. And Richard finally understood the lesson beneath the grief. He wasn't here to mourn anymore. He was here to continue. Richard barely slept that night. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his enormous, echoing bedroom. A bedroom that suddenly felt like a museum of everything he'd built and everything he'd overlooked. His house was spotless. His kitchen had granite countertops. His den had a framed photo of him shaking hands with a senator. But his son had spent the final months of his life sitting on a broken couch in a shelter, helping children read. Daniel, who had every privilege his father's success could buy, had sought out the one corner of the world Richard had forgotten, and now Richard couldn't unsee it. By morning, something inside him had shifted. Something deep, something quiet, something that felt like a promise finally breaking open. He didn't go to the office. He didn't check emails. He didn't take calls. He drove straight back to the shelter. When he got there, Ethan and Caleb were outside. They were sitting on the steps, their backpacks at their feet. Caleb held a half-eaten cereal bar. Ethan watched Richard's car pull up with confusion in his eyes. Richard approached slowly. "You came back," Caleb whispered, like he couldn't quite believe it. Richard nodded. "I told you I would." Ethan stood, tense at first, then softened. "We didn't think you meant today." "I meant today," Richard said gently. The shelter director approached, a tired woman in her late 50s with silver hair pulled into a loose bun. She carried papers in one arm and exhaustion in the other. "You're Richard Clark?" she asked, wiping her hands on her cardigan. "Yes." "I heard you talked with the boys yesterday," she said cautiously. "They think the world of your son." Richard swallowed hard. "I'm starting to understand why." The director nodded sadly. He was special. Those boys adored him. Anyone could see that. She gestured toward the building. "Would you like a tour? You look like you've got questions." "I have more than questions," Richard said quietly. "I have regrets, and I have time, and I have resources, and I plan to use all of them." The director blinked in surprise. Caleb beamed. Ethan stared, stunned. Inside, Richard didn't see walls and broken furniture anymore. He saw possibilities. He saw the place Daniel had loved. He saw where the boys slept, thin mattresses covered in mismatched blankets, shoes lined against the wall like tiny soldiers, a shelf of books so worn their spines were breaking. He saw the cafeteria, small tables, dented trays, a fridge that groaned louder than it cooled. He saw the study room, a cracked whiteboard, 2 broken chairs, stacks of half-used notebooks, and worksheets scribbled with Daniel's handwriting. He saw everything his son had touched, and everything that needed to change. The director stood quietly beside him as he looked around. "We do our best," she said softly. "We just don't have the funding." Richard turned to her. "You will now." Her eyebrows lifted. "Mr. Clark." "No," he said firmly. "This isn't charity. This is me finishing something Daniel started." His voice caught at the end, but he didn't let it break. The director pressed a hand to her chest. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Richard said. "Just show me what you need." The next hours changed lives. Richard sat at a table with the director, while Ethan and Caleb watched from a distance, whispering to each other in awe. He wrote checks. He made calls. He arranged meetings. He took notes like a man possessed by purpose. He approved. Full renovation of the shelter. New beds, furniture, heating, plumbing. Meals funded for a full year. Mental health services. A computer lab. A new tutoring center in Daniel's honor. Scholarships for every child who lived there. And then he turned to Ethan and Caleb. "I want you two to have a home," he said softly. Ethan stiffened. "We have a home." Richard shook his head gently. "You have a shelter. You deserve better." Caleb looked up nervously. "Like a real home?" Richard crouched so he was eye level. "I'm not here to take you away from your life," he said. "I'm here to protect it, to help, to be whatever Daniel hoped someone would be for you." Ethan's eyes filled, but he blinked fast, trying to act older than he was. "Why?" he whispered. "Why help us?" Richard's voice grew thick. "Because my son loved you," he said, "and because he taught me what love really looks like." Caleb reached forward first, wrapping his arms around Richard's neck with a sudden, desperate hug. Richard froze. Then he hugged back, pulling the child close. Ethan hesitated only a moment before stepping into the embrace too, arms around both of them. For the first time since Daniel's death, Richard felt warmth instead of cold, purpose instead of pain, direction instead of drifting. And in the middle of that group hug, fragile, new, healing, he finally understood. His son hadn't left him behind. He had left him a beginning. That afternoon, Richard filed paperwork to become the boys' official mentor and guardian advocate. He didn't replace Daniel. He didn't want to. He simply became what Daniel had been building toward. And when he drove the boys to a store that evening, letting them choose clothes, shoes, books, anything they needed, Ethan whispered quietly in the back seat, "Danny would have liked this." Richard nodded, swallowing his emotion. "I know," he whispered. "He's here." Caleb held the blue toy car in his lap, smiling softly out the window. Richard glanced at them in the rearview mirror. 2 boys who had nothing, now holding everything his son left behind. Love, hope, a future. And he vowed, silently, "I won't fail you the way I failed him." The next Sunday morning arrived quieter than most. Richard woke before his alarm. Not startled, not restless, not weighed down by grief the way he had been for months. Just awake, in a stillness that felt different. Not empty, purposeful. He dressed simply, not like a CEO, but like a father visiting a place that mattered. At the front door, he paused. Two small figures stepped up beside him, backpacks on, freshly washed shirts, shoes tied neatly. Ethan stood tall, trying to look composed. Caleb clutched the blue toy car in both hands. "You ready?" Richard asked softly. Ethan nodded. Caleb whispered, "Yeah." Richard offered his hands, one to each boy. They each took it without hesitation. The three of them walked together through the cemetery gates, not rushed, not scared, not burdened, just together. The grounds were quiet, dew sparkling on the grass. Birds chirped in soft patterns overhead. Even the air felt gentler, warmer than usual. As they approached Daniel's grave, Ethan slowed. Caleb held tighter to Richard's hand. And when they finally stood in front of the headstone, all three paused. A moment of stillness, honoring a life that had touched them more profoundly than they ever realized. Richard knelt first. He set down the fresh bouquet, bright, full, alive. Not the kind he'd bought out of tradition, the kind Daniel would have chosen himself. Ethan placed a notebook beside it, the one Daniel used to help him study. Caleb placed the blue toy car gently against the stone. Then the three of them stood quietly, letting memory soften the edges of heartbreak. After a long silence, Richard finally spoke. "I used to come here because I felt lost." His voice was calm, reflective. "I thought grief was supposed to be heavy, cold, all-consuming." He looked at the headstone, his expression softening. "But I realize now, grief is only heavy when you're standing in it alone." He exhaled slowly, the breath shaking just a little. "These boys, they showed me parts of you I never saw, parts I wish I'd known sooner. But I know them now, and I'll honor them." Ethan looked up at him, eyes shining. Caleb leaned against his side. Richard continued, voice thick but gentle. "You didn't just leave pain behind. You left people. You left lessons. You left love." He smiled, a small, fragile smile. "You saved them, son. And through them, you saved me too." Ethan blinked hard, trying not to cry. Caleb sniffled. Richard placed a hand on each boy's shoulder. Ethan spoke next. His voice was quiet but steady. "Thank you for helping us, for believing us. Nobody ever did that before." Richard squeezed his shoulder. "You deserved it. All of it." Caleb wiped his face with his sleeve. "Danny was the best person we ever knew," Caleb said softly. "Except maybe you, now." Richard almost broke right there. He knelt again, pulling both boys into him. An embrace that didn't feel forced or uncertain anymore. It felt like family. When the boys stepped back, Richard looked at the headstone one last time. He whispered, "Your kindness didn't end here. It just began." A breeze passed through the cemetery, light, warm, almost like an acknowledgement. Ethan noticed. Caleb smiled. And for the first time since the accident, Richard didn't feel like he was visiting a grave. He felt like he was honoring a legacy. Walking back through the gates, Richard reflected. Sometimes life breaks you, not to destroy you, but to rebuild you into someone stronger, someone softer, someone your loved ones would be proud of. He held the boys' hands as they walked toward the car. Kindness doesn't die with the person who carried it, he thought. It lives on in the people they touched. He helped Caleb into the back seat. Ethan buckled in beside him, and as Richard started the engine, he took one last glance at the cemetery in the rearview mirror. Where grief once suffocated him, hope now stood quietly. Not loud, not dramatic, just present, just enough. The final lesson whispered through his mind, like a voice he knew too well. The world doesn't change because you made money. It changes because you made someone's life better. He smiled faintly, eyes warming. Rest easy, son, he whispered. We'll take it from here. And with that, Richard drove forward with two boys who now walked in the light of Daniel's love and a heart finally learning how to heal.